after 7, we're still more on time than I think the in-person version of this would be. So thank you all for tuning in on time. So tonight we're really excited to host this virtual book launch for Peter Cole's new edition on PM Press of Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly. So Peter, there's the book that Kim's holding up. Peter is joined by Kim Kelly, who is a labor journalist, among other things, and a labor organizer, and Royce Adams, who is from Philly originally, and Royce is a longshoreman in ILA Local 1291. So Kim and Royce will be in discussion with the author, Peter Cole, who is a professor of history at Western Illinois University and research associate in the Society, Work, and Development program at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He is the author of Wobblies on the Waterfront, Interracial Unionism in Progressive Era Philadelphia, and the award-winning Dock Worker Power, Race and Activism in Durban and the San Francisco Bay Area. He also is founder and co-director of the Chicago Race Riot of 1919 Commemoration Project, CRR19. So I also wanted to thank the Philly IWW and PM Press for co-sponsoring this event. And again, thank you everyone for tuning in. And I'm gonna pass it off to Robin Cartwright from the Philly IWW, and then we'll start the discussion from there. And one other thing I just wanted to add is we'll have a Q&A after the discussion. So put your question throughout the event in the chat at the bottom of your screen. So I'll be checking the chat later, and then around 8 o'clock, we'll open it up for discussion, and I'll be putting some of these questions to the panelists. So now I'm gonna move it over to Robin Cartwright. Thank you.
Thank you. The Philadelphia IWW is pleased to co-sponsor this event. Peter Cole's work on our early history is popular with the members of our branch, especially his work on Local 8 is an important part of our history. Both a century ago and now, the IWW has always believed that the working class and the employing class have nothing in common. Our interests and their interests are inextricably opposed. Sorry about that, thank you. So long as hunger and want are found among billions of working people, while the 1% have all the good things, there can be no peace. Conflict between workers and employers will inevitably continue until workers organize as a class, seize control of the economy, and abolish capitalism. Employers often seek to pit one set of workers against each other, along racial or other lines. This allows them to maintain the upper hand by dividing us against each other. It also misleads a portion of the working class into thinking we have interests in common with our employer. Successfully organizing a union against any employer requires overcoming divisions within the workforce and not letting the boss play different groups against each other. The IWW has always sought to organize the entire working class, including the parts ignored or considered unorganizable by other unions. In the early 20th century, that meant organizing Blacks and women and immigrants. Today, we still do that. We organize incarcerated workers, gig workers, food service workers, many other workers often ignored by more moderate or conservative labor unions. On Philadelphia's docks a century ago, that approach allowed us to unify and organize a racially divided workforce against employers. It was done in the heyday of Jim Crow, in a workforce split between white and Black workers, as well as between immigrants and non-immigrants. We maintained a closed shop there for a decade and had partial control over hiring and firing. All of this was done without relying on the National Labor Relations Board, which didn't exist at the time, or even signing a contract. There was no strike pledge, no grievance system, none of that bureaucratic stuff. Strikes were resolved with verbal agreements, not written contracts. Instead of filing grievances, disputes were resolved with walkouts. We relied on solidarity and direct action, not contracts or state support. This ensured that the union continued to fight for its members and did not sell out or divert discontent into ineffective bureaucratic channels. Our history in Philadelphia shows that another kind of union, one that organizes all workers and doesn't rely on contracts, is possible. I look forward to hearing more about fellow worker Fletcher and his role in our history.
All right. Well, thank you so much to everyone for coming this evening. So let me echo Matt's earlier welcome. And thanks to the Philly IWW for co-sponsoring. And thanks for the Wooden Shoe. Thanks to PM Press. Thanks to my fellow panelists, Royce Adams and Kim Kelly. And especially thanks to everyone who chose to spend some of their free time listening to me and some of my friends talk about history and why history matters so much today. Yeah, I'm going to give a brief presentation and then turn things over to Kim and Royce. And then the last third approximately of the event will be open for conversation, questions, discussion, etc. So hopefully I'll be able to succeed with sharing my screen. All right. Can someone give me a thumbs up saying that you can see my screen? Thank you, Kim. Awesome. I always say assume nothing. Can you still see my screen? Awesome. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. So Ben Fletcher is the person who we're really sort of focusing on tonight. He was, I suggest, the most important leader in the IWW's most effective interracial union, which controlled the Philadelphia waterfront for about a decade because of its militancy and direct action tactics and commitment to revolutionary unionism. Fletcher is one of the most important Black labor figures in the history of the United States, yet very few people, even on the left, know his name. Yet he couldn't be more relevant to more time and to many of the political projects of our time. I hope you'll agree. Ben Fletcher helped build the most important interracial, multi-ethnic union in the early 20th century. Ben Fletcher was a founder of and a leader in Local 8, which was the branch in the industrial workers of the world that the Philadelphia dock workers belonged to. When I think about Ben Fletcher, I think about him as a sort of a central figure in sort of the struggle against racism, the struggle against capitalism, the struggle really for Black liberation, but also the struggle for a socialist world. He was the leader when he first became leader in this union. Actually, the union was majority white, although over time became predominantly Black. And thinking about Ben Fletcher, not just as a wobbly, but also just sort of as a militant African-American in an era of tremendous racism are sort of subjects that are important for, I think, us to think about. But also, honestly, in the early 20th century, the United States was incredibly racist, was incredibly xenophobic, where extreme socioeconomic inequality existed, arguably more so, right? Like, and so you think things might be rough today. Honestly, the early 20th century was even more challenging for many of us. The industrial workers of the world, I am aware many people in this audience may be familiar with, but just quickly, because I like to assume nothing about people. You know, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, was founded in 1905. It was founded because not only was capitalism failing most people in the United States, the so-called labor movement of that era, which was represented by the American Federation of Labor, chose not to organize women, chose not to organize African Americans, chose not to organize most immigrants, chose to not organize most workers in the working class, right? Because they chose to be predominantly white, male, native born in skilled occupations. And they chose to focus exclusively on so-called bread and butter issues, essentially wages and hours and conditions without anything else, right? The same time period, 1905, racism was rampant. This is just 9 years after Plessy v. Ferguson legalized racial segregation in the United States. Immigration was very high in this era, but xenophobia was ferocious. when the IWW was founded in Chicago in 1905, it was essentially very much by the people who were leaders in unions and socialist organizations that were very intentionally creating a socialist labor movement in opposition to the American Federation of Labor. That's why basically it was a veritable who's who of people on the left, right? Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party, but before that, the leader of the Pullman strike in 1894, maybe the most important strike of the late 19th century, was a co-founder. Mother Jones, a socialist and legendary labor organizer and opponent of child labor, was there. Lucy Parsons, the widow of Albert Parsons, one of the Haymarket martyrs, was a co-founder. Big Bill Haywood, the leader of the most militant and largest mine worker union in the West, was there and was the sort of, chair of the convention, which he called the Continental Congress of the Working Class. 1905 Chicago, I'm speaking to you actually from Chicago tonight, right, was the place to be, right? Like that was also happened to be the greatest industrial city in the country, right? The IWW not only thought of itself as a socialist movement, it very much thought of itself as an internationalist movement. That's why their name is the Industrial Workers of the World, yeah, plain and simple. Some people suggested it should be called the Industrial Workers of America in opposition to the American Federation of Labor. And in fact, that was voted down, and instead they created an Industrial Workers of the World model, right? And then within just a few years, there were IWW branches in dozens of countries, right? And so although it was largest in the United States and arguably most influential, right, in the United States for several decades, it was a global struggle because they understood in 1905 that capitalism was global, and so therefore the solution to capitalism has to be global, right? And so that is all to their credit that the IWW was thinking in these ways, right, in 1905. And their members are often called Wobblies, and their motto, which many other unions later adopted, is an injury to one is an injury to all. Right. Now, Ben Fletcher wasn't in Philadelphia, not in Chicago in 1905. He was just 15 years old. But he was born and raised in the city of Philadelphia, where many of you may be right now. His parents were originally from Virginia, and they moved to Philadelphia maybe in the late 1880s. Based on the age of his parents, it is a very good chance that his parents were born enslaved in the 1850s, although we don't know that, and Fletcher never said as much, right? But it's the great majority of Black people in Virginia and before the Civil War were enslaved, and so his parents very likely were also. We just know that they moved to Philadelphia in the late 1880s, and that Fletcher was born in 1890. Yeah, when Fletcher was born in Philadelphia, it's a very interesting place. It's the largest Black population outside of the South at that time. Had a long and old Black community, was where, for instance, the African Methodist Episcopal Church was founded. You know, it was a leading center of the abolitionist movement, but also it was deeply racist, right? And W.E.B. Du Bois, the legendary Black radical and intellectual and activist, wrote his first book called The Philadelphia Negro, and published in 1899. And he basically was writing about South Philadelphia because at that time that was where most Black people lived. He said basically Black experience is defined by racism, especially in occupations, that basically Black men and Black women's job opportunities were very limited, regardless of the skills that they may have had, the ambition that they might have had, right? Philadelphia was also legendary for being a very conservative city. For those of you in Philadelphia, that may not sound surprising, right? Philadelphia was considered to be a very anti-union town, even though it was heavily industrialized, the third biggest city and one of the most important industrial centers of the country. That's why it was called by one labor organizer the graveyard of unionism, and another as a scab town. Now, 1910, or maybe 1911, honestly, we're not sure, Ben Fletcher joined the IWW and the Socialist Party, which was Debs's party, right? It was very common, actually, in the first 5 or 8 years of the IWW for people to be in both the IWW, the labor movement, and the Socialist Party, a political movement, right? And in fact, socialists saw the IWW for a while as the trade union arm of the socialists. There was, however, for a number of reasons, rifts among these groups. Anti-leftists will be familiar with left sectarianism. Yeah, and so there were divisions then, and essentially most of the Wobblies left the socialists and vice versa in the early 19 teens, right? And so Fletcher probably left the Socialist Party shortly after he joined, although we're not really sure. He also was working on the waterfront and various other occupations by the hour. But very quickly in 1911, as no later than 1912, he shows up in IW newspapers for being an important organizer in the Philadelphia area, not just in Philadelphia, but up and down the Delaware River, including down in Chester, for example. And I do want to highlight also, he would have been organizing among predominantly white and European immigrants, right? At that time, most people in the Wobblies were in fact not African Americans. Now, I just want to talk quickly about dock work because, well, that's his occupation and that was the union he led. You know, in Philadelphia, just like every other port city in the country and pretty much around the world, dock workers would be hired by the job. They'd have to go down to the riverfront, the Delaware, maybe the Schuylkill, and get picked by the boss, right? But hundreds of people might show up for dozens of jobs, right? And there was no guarantee you'd get a job that day. Right? This was called the shape up, and dock workers hated it because you often didn't get hired and you were often being basically pitted against each other, right? The boss had all the power, right? All the hiring. You often had to bribe the boss in order to get a job, or you might be of the same ethnic group, the same religious group, the same neighborhood group, etc. In other words, the boss played favorites, right? And so the shape up was the classic divide and conquer strategy, right, that employers use all across the United States and our world, whether it's 1913 or whether it's 2021, and it was widely understood as such. If you got hired on the docks in Philadelphia, or for that matter, other places, it's also important to understand this work was incredibly hard, very dangerous. Hours were long. Shifts might be literally 24 to 36 hours. And the weather could be bad, it could be day, it could be night, it could be raining, it could be snowing. You know, you could die anytime you walk onto the waterfront, right? And everyone also understood that. And in fact, one of the most dangerous occupations for many generations was dock work, right? But after you finish that job, whether you were loading or unloading a ship, you may not have another job for days, weeks, or months, right? This is called casual labor or precarious work as we now refer to it. The only other point I'd like to make about dock workers, although I could talk for a long time about the occupation, is that although it's very hard to get a job, dock workers work in pairs and in gangs, right? And so it's important to understand that the nature of the work is collective, which inculcates into workers a collective identity. We need each other. You can't load or unload a ship by yourself. You can't load or unload even maybe that cargo sling by yourself, right? You need each other. And also, who's going to look out for you in the event that something is dangerous or you get hurt, right? Simultaneous, there is no upward mobility. No dock worker becomes a ship owner, right? And ship owners and the other employers very much saw and sort of encouraged this us versus them mentality as well. This fits very nicely, admittedly, with the IWW vision of that workers and employers share nothing in common, right? And we have to keep that in mind, but we have to understand that even without unions, workers are developing collective identities, right? And working class identities, and often are working together, even without a union, formal union, to sort of maybe improve their conditions. Now in Philadelphia, in this time period, the city is large, it's the third largest city in the country, over 1 million people. It's very diverse, but it's relatively less diverse than, say, New York or Chicago. But the waterfront is maybe 1/3 African-American workers, 1/3 Irish and Irish-American, and maybe 1/3 other European immigrants, Poles, Lithuanians, Eastern European Jews, Italians, and so on, right? Now, this sort of workplace, or I should say this sort of workforce, most unions at that time won't touch, right? Why? Because it has too many Black people and immigrants, right? Like the IWW, of course, has no prejudice against people based on race or nationality, sex or craft, right? Now, that doesn't mean always in practice the IWW lived up to its ideals, none of us do, right? But the IWW was founded upon the idea that we will organize all workers, right, period, right? And so whereas most unions didn't want to touch a diverse workforce like this one, the IWW was ready. So in the spring of 1913, thousands of dock workers in Philadelphia went on strike. And it was during this strike that Ben Fletcher and the IWW basically show up and organize these people better, charter a union called Local 8. And this strike, even before it was won, it already demonstrated what the IWW was interested in doing. They organized a diverse work committee, strike committee, I should say. Just like the year before in the Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, one member of every ethnic group on strike was on the strike committee, right? And so they wanted to make sure equal representation was part and parcel of their activism. After 2 weeks on strike, they had won. They won a raise, but they also won union recognition from the employers. And for the next almost 10 years, Local 8 dominated the waterfront. What did Local 8 do? So again, just quickly, first and foremost, Local 8 immediately integrated itself. Right now, the union was already open to and had members of, but before the union controlled the waterfront, gangs were racially and ethnically segregated. That was normal, not just in the waterfront, but most every workplace in America was segregated by race, ethnicity, and gender. Okay, Local 8 integrates the gangs. How do we break down racism? We get to know each other, right? We work together. Right? Then we learn, in fact, we probably have more in common than we have differences, right? And so they integrated the work gangs. Who had created segregation? The bosses, right? This is 51 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 forced many institutions in America to integrate, right? And so this is, I call this integration from below, right? Because this was forced from below. Not only do they integrate the gangs, their social and political events are all integrated according to all records we have. And leadership ranks were also integrated, meaning that it was required that there would be equal numbers of African-American and white people in leadership positions within the local. When the union also took control, they abolished the shape-up. Let me repeat that. They abolished the shape-up. Instead, the bosses would have to call up the union hall, right, and say, we want, say, 50 workers to show up at Pier 13 tomorrow morning, and then the union will distribute the work, right? Who gets the work? If you've paid your dues are actually very low in the IWW, right? You get a monthly button. Here's a few pictures of these buttons. Some people on eBay drive up the price of these things, and so I don't really own many of them, right? But nevertheless, there's some of these buttons are still out there for those who are into collectibles, right? And if you had the right button, because after all, there's thousands of guys on the waterfront. You don't know who's in the union and who's a sort of a loyal member and who's not. But if you see everyone's button on their jacket or their hat, you know. The bosses also know this. And so when the bosses try to hire people who might not be union or sort of good members in standing, other workers basically say, we won't work with these guys unless you fire them and call the hall up to get some members of our union who are in fact in good standing, right? And if you don't, we're gonna strike, right? Because of course the Wobbly's always said the greatest power workers have is to stop work. Right. Now, the Local 8 also did things like they celebrated their strikes. They celebrated, I should say, their birthday. Every year they had an annual strike. They stopped work because what better way to celebrate work than to not work, right? This is one or several examples of what the Wobbly's often called and still called direct action, right? Many of these are not documented, right? We know about some of these actions, but it's impossible that we could know about all of them. The strike and the threat of the strike is actually one of the key tactics that the IWW promoted. Let us note that this was understood before the IWW, and this is not unique to the IWW, right? Workers understand these things, even if you're not in the Wobblies, right? But the Wobblies very much promoted these ideas of direct action. It was core to their ideology, right? The waterfront in Philadelphia was dominated by the IWW for upwards of 10 years into really almost 1923, right? And Fletcher was an important leader, but not the only important leader in this story. But let me talk more about Fletcher. So Ben Fletcher was the most important African-American in Philadelphia, but also in the entire IWW. It was understood as such. And so he was often sent to organize workers, black and white workers in other ports: Boston, Providence, New York, Baltimore, Norfolk, Virginia, right? And other ports up and down the coast. The IWW also understood that, you know, if shipping companies can basically move their cargo around and weaken the workers by sending the work to other ports where they don't have to deal with the IWW, right? And so Fletcher, one time when he was down in Norfolk in early 1917, was threatened with a lynching, right? He was organizing on the Norfolk waterfront. The image on the left is of a Norfolk waterfront. The image on the right is of a Norfolk dock worker, not Fletcher. He heard that he was supposed to, he might get killed. And so friends of his put him aboard a ship and sent him up to Boston, right, in early 1917, where he ended up living and organizing for several more months. It was in Boston, actually, when the United States declared war. right? World War I, 1917, right? As soon as the United States government declared war, what happened? The US Congress passed the espionage law that made it essentially a crime to speak out against the war. They also passed something called the Sedition Act, which reinforced that, right? Fletcher and hundreds of other IWW leaders from around the country were immediately surveyed, spied on, right, and started to be investigated because immediately after the United States declared war, the first group of people in the United States that the federal government went after were the Wobblies, because it was the largest, most powerful revolutionary organization in the country, right? Fletcher and hundreds of others received basically indictments and were sentenced or sent to trial. And Fletcher famously was part of the largest of these trials in Chicago in 1918, the spring and summer of 1918, where about 100 people, Fletcher being the only African-American, were put on trial for espionage and sedition. It, of course, is during this time that Fletcher became known beyond his friend group, right? That he was a really funny guy, right? Because there are several famous quotes of his from when he was on trial. The most famous of which is that when the judge started to issue sentences at the end of the trial, and Fletcher turned to his friend Big Bill Haywood and said, geez, the judge isn't using very proper grammar this evening. How's that been? Well, his sentences are much too long, right? Any academic could, of course, be accused of that same crime, long sentences. So like Fletcher and about 100 people are sentenced to prison for the crime. What is their crime? Their crime is being radical, right? I mean, there's actually zero evidence brought to the trial specifically against Ben Fletcher, zero evidence brought to pretty much anyone in Philadelphia. And really they were tried based on their words, which is that they were critical of the United States war effort, right? Of course, many other people were also sentenced to prison for the same crime, the most famous being Eugene Debs, who also was sentenced to prison for speaking out against the war. Fletcher received a 10-year sentence and a $30,000 fine. When you adjust for inflation, you're talking about upwards of a $300,000 fine, right, for the crime of being a radical. This photograph and the other one that's on the cover of my book and other places are actually the photographs of when he was arrived in prison in Leavenworth, Kansas in September of 1918 to begin his 10-year pull. Of course, Leavenworth is famous as being a place where there was lots of radicals sent during and after World War I. There was over 100 Wobblies there, there were communists there, there were pacifists there, there were quote, common criminals there. There were Mexican revolutionaries like Ricardo Flores Magón was there. Fletcher didn't talk about his time in prison very much, but Magón talked about it as he felt it was caught by the formidable mechanism of a monstrous machine in my flesh, yet ripped open and my bones crushed and my moans fill the space, right? And so while Fletcher was in prison in Leavenworth, the picture on the right includes Fletcher and some other people, right? That's sometimes was nicknamed the University of Radicalism because there were so many radicals in Leavenworth in the late 19-teens and early 1920s. Of course, the federal government continued to spy on Fletcher and all the other political prisoners. And that's ironically why we have a lot of good evidence about what Fletcher was thinking and writing about while he was in prison, is because we have this. And most of my book is in fact original documents about everything that Fletcher wrote and everything that was written about Fletcher. But one letter that Fletcher wrote is highlighted here. He wrote it on New Year's Eve, right before 1920. Remember, the Soviet-Russian Revolution had begun just a few years earlier. There's an Irish Revolution, there's a Mexican Revolution. A lot of people thought that there was going to be a lot more revolutions happening in the world in 1920. And so Fletcher, when he writes to a friend, a socialist in Milwaukee, New Year's Eve 1920, he says, "We live in momentous times. None of us are gifted with the power of clairvoyance as to be able to foretell the day or the hour. Therefore, the first and most important duty is for all of us to prepare ourselves for the final chapter in the life of capitalism." Fletcher was still in prison, but Local 8 continued to hold on to power. In fact, Philadelphia was a very important port, and I should note that even, a lot of war material was sent out of Philadelphia, and even though the government hated the Wobblies supposedly, they continued to use IWW members because they controlled the waterfront. I'll try to sort of wrap this up more quickly. In late 1922, Local 8, Fletcher is actually out of prison by late 22. Local 8 is pushing for the 8-hour day. Employers don't want to give it. There is a huge wave of repression against unions in the years after World War I. There are a bunch of big strikes, most of which fail. There's also rising racism and xenophobia. Congress will pass a law that basically dramatically cuts immigration. The Ku Klux Klan has several million members, right? The list of sort of racism and xenophobia can go on. Local 8 splits, right? It can't sort of handle the sort of the racism and xenophobia as well as the significant government repression at the local and federal levels. A few years later, the Philadelphia waterfront is reorganized by the more mainstream union, the International Longshore Association, which is part of the AFL. The ILA was able to get an 8-hour day and a union contract for its Philadelphia members, but Local 8 was a very different thing. Local 8 was a Democratic union and the ILA was not. And although African Americans belonged to the ILA, the gangs were resegregated. The shape up was resumed. The union did not fight to try to prevent those things. And in fact, it wasn't until the 60s, really the late 60s or into the 70s even, that gangs and the unions itself was more integrated. The IWW continued to be anti-racist. This image on the left is sort of an amazing image, right, which I know very little about, unfortunately, but its power diminished. Fletcher, meanwhile, had moved to New York City around 1930, 31. Why? I'm not sure. I wish I knew. He was still committed to the IWW and an organizer in Lower Manhattan, lived in Brooklyn with his second wife. But he had a series of major health problems, including several strokes in the 30s and 40s. And so even though he was not an old man by any means, really his sort of best days, including his organizing days, were behind him, although he spoke in public on a number of occasions in the 30s into the mid 30s, and people continually remarked about how powerful a speaker he remained. He lived in a neighborhood called Bedford-Stuyvesant that at that time was not predominantly Black, although it later became so. And he died in 1949 and is buried in Brooklyn in an unmarked grave. Although there's a group of us who are actively working to sort of raise funds in order to get a marker for him in the section of that Brooklyn cemetery. And that's going to happen this year, guys and gals, right? And so pay attention, because we're going to start asking for money, right, to raise funds for that marker, which we're excited about happening in 2021. So Fletcher was a brilliant man. He was probably, well, he remains the most important African-American in the IWW. I always say to people who are unfamiliar with the Wobblies, if you've heard of Fred Hampton, you should know about Ben Fletcher, right? They were about the same age when they were most radical. Fletcher, you know, it's an unfair comparison, but Fletcher was a socialist militant radical who had organized an interracial union in an incredibly racist and xenophobic time, right? He was committed to socialism and unapologetic, and he went to prison for it, right? And he suffered other consequences, as did many other Wobblies, right? He was remained committed to the IWW, but more broadly to socialism until his dying days. I very much appreciate your attention and look forward to listening to Kim and Royce, as well as other questions and comments for the rest of our session. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right, is this the part where I jump in?
Yes, please.
Man, I mean, that's a hard act to follow, but I'll be brief with a couple of applause. Yeah, people are saying thank you and applause. You did great. Yeah, so reading this book was a lot of fun because I'm a big labor nerd, like a lot of us I'm sure are. And one of the most interesting things about it was, you know, obviously Peter had done all this research and has a really great introduction and biography of Ben Fletcher in the beginning. But the rest of the book, which is a lot of pages, are these primary sources of his letters, of these documents, of his, you know, his arrest records and his obituaries. And there's a lot of really interesting things in there. And there was one that I came across that struck me because I just read a different book about a different Wobbly organizer named Matilda Rabinowitz, who was a Russian Jewish woman who immigrated here as a kid, immediately went to work in the garment factories in New York, and pretty quickly found her way to socialism in the IWW and became really influential in organizing strikes and helping workers around that time. But she's not very well known either. And it made me think about how so many important organizers and radicals and workers never get the attention they deserve, never get the credit they deserve. And Ben Fletcher is one of them. And he is, I mean, there's correspondence and articles about him prior to his death or after his death in here that refer to him in the same breath as Dr. Martin Luther King. Like, he was a big deal. He made a massive impact on people's lives, particularly on Black workers' lives in a time where they were valued even less than they are now, which is a fucking feat. And I think it's really incredible that we have this document here that we can page through, we can read about his life. There's a little, it seems like it was difficult to find a lot of personal information because Ben Fletcher was a working class radical dude back in the day. He wasn't, you know, creating the voluminous amounts of correspondence and diaries and New York Times features that, you know, the upper class and more famous people were getting. You know, he had dinner with Carlos Tresca and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. He was friends with Big Will Haywood, but this is kind of the first time we're really getting a deep look into his life and his work. And I'm really glad that that's happening now, because how many other Ben Fletchers have we not heard about, and how many are we missing now? And that's something that hopefully there'll be more books and more people writing about this and more people getting this working class history out there, because we don't know, you know, how are we going to figure out where we need to go if we can't look back on where we've been? And that's why I'm really excited to talk to you, Royce, because you're kind of a living, breathing, you know, Ben Fletcher is gone, but you're in that tradition, you know? And I wanted to ask you, you know, it's something that, you know, Peter just pointed out, the ILA and Local 8 weren't always on the best of terms. They were opponents at one point in time. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about how your work within the union and your experiences within the union have kind of worked to help keep the spirit of Local 8 and of Ben Fletcher's work alive. You're still on mute though.
You hear me now?
Awesome.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What Peter just recently stated about like 100 years ago, we have to look at, and I'm not that young, but see, I got on the Philadelphia waterfront based on my great uncle, my grandmother's brother, in which when I think of Ben Fletcher, he was younger than my grandfather, you know, 9 years younger. And my great uncle came here to Philadelphia, then brought the rest of the family later. And he worked on the waterfront. And I can remember, you know, him saying to me, matter of fact, I was on the waterfront when I was a kid. I can remember him taking me down here in Philadelphia on the waterfront into the galley on the ships, climbing the gangplank. But he had said to me when I was in college, I got in good trouble and bad trouble up there. I was at Lincoln University, and this is in the 60s. So I had determined that was going to end up being my destination, okay? And he had told me that my great uncle, Fred Smith, he told me that you're going to have to deal with Alex Thomas, Dick Asper. He's telling me about people that were already there, okay? I didn't believe that, but that happened. I came to the waterfront in 1973. That was after Thanksgiving. And as Peter has written about things on South Africa, I can remember because I was in, when you talk about Fred Hampton, I was in Chicago. Pre that time, because in the 60s, just like with the introduction that I'm kind of slipping now. The introduction to your book with Kelly, he started out because of his time in college. He had started studying. And see, I remember when I started moving away from Black nationalism, that's how I went to school, and came into, from Malcolm X to Lenin. Then I ended up on the waterfront in 73, but I had joined just like, you know, I joined the Communist Party, all that, 1971, 50 years ago. And so being on the waterfront in the 70s, before I even got in the Union, knocked my first ship off. Because here's what Peter has been writing about with Fletcher. And I don't think anybody has noticed this. The Wobblies, Ben Fletcher in the main, had a great influence on what the ILA had actually structured on, even with the segregation that we had. Just like you just mentioned, how the hiring system go, all that and everything. And that's why presently today, in our membership, and I'm 2 generations apart, they don't know anything about that. Just like in the first edition, Peter wrote about people that I knew. You see what I'm saying? You had Poole, Henry Barlick, these people. Today, many people that have 25, 30 years here, they didn't really know them. But I'm saying that the relationship and I would say the understanding what was going on with the Wobblies, particularly Black longshoremen on the waterfront, they picked that style up. I saw that the negotiate. First of all, when it came to the waterfront, I was embraced by the leadership, being followed. The FBI had been on me since I was in college. And I got drafted so many times. But they would say, don't hire them. These guys are communists. These guys are Black Panthers, because at that time in 74, the Black Panthers was doing it out on the West Coast on the port. So we was under that surveillance. So anyway, next thing I know, I'm in the ILA conventions. The union officials, when like Peter said earlier, you had some of everybody on the waterfront, all different walks of lives, every color, but there was strict segregation. All gangs were segregated, okay. And that's how you did battle, but you always had Blacks in leadership. That's why I can always remember Dick Askew. When I first saw him take on issues at the International Convention, because what was left from Local 8 in Philadelphia is where the New York, because Philadelphia was the second most militant port to New York, that they called, we was known as the Philadelphia Rebels. I had to witness that at my first convention. I never missed a convention until I was sequestered. When Reagan came there to make the ILA vote him in the 84 elections, vote for him. So you would always, Dick Askew would defy the employers, cuss them out. And, brought me along to see this here. That's where I had to get my style from. And I would figure, when Peter was telling, we knew we had this militant history on the waterfront. We didn't know anything about the Wobblies. I did. I managed the book, so I knew some things about the Wobblies. But the relationship of Blacks in the ILA, Local 1291, my local, that was the majority. We was right there. You couldn't get past us. You see, we was right there at the point of production. Anything else? We had strikes. We might have 3 strikes in a week. You know what I mean? We would shut down anytime. And I believe that was inherited from the style of what was taking place with the Wobblies. It was just that militancy there. And even with segregation, you have a white gang say, they call us a work stoppage, and the Black gangs had to respect that, go with them. And the same was with Black gangs that would do it, because we all worked in separate hatches. That's why I was able, before I got in the union, to knock a ship off from South Africa. I watched the role of things that was going on. And I just, we had people that came down to go against working those ships from different organizations. I was in an organization that we started right before I came to the waterfront, the National Anti-Imperialist Movement in solidarity with African Liberation. Henry Winston and Oliver Tambo had set that up, and I had been in the Soviet Union, came right down. So I said, here it is. We had like many organizations, Welfare Rights, Black Panther Party, Young Socialist Alliance. That was, you had different groups that came in, but it wasn't strategic enough to come and ask longshoremen not to work the ship. So I had to go on and act like a foreman and tell everybody to come up off the ship. But that came from what Dick Askew, I learned from them, and they brought me into meetings and all that there. The militancy was there, and I think it was left behind. What the struggles were, in the early part of that century, the last century, the 20th century. And so we come to see, leadership, because of the racism that exists, what was taking place all the time for us to be separate and militant in a way. Didn't know anything about, and still don't know anything about Wobblies or former leaders in the ILA. You know,
you talked a lot about, you know, the militancy and solidarity that was needed to, you know, to go on all those strikes and to notch all those wins. And it seems like that spirit of militancy has sort of, obviously it's still out here in the labor movement, but it's not at the forefront. It's not as, you know, it's not as tough as it used to be. What do you think that the current generation can do to kind of recapture that spirit of militancy? Because Lord knows we need it.
Well, I'll start with COVID. It's going to be with us a long time. And see, we are essential workers on the waterfront. And just like it's going to be very difficult we have to get that history of what's taking place right now and studying, particularly in my field of work on the waterfront, what took place 50 years ago, starting with what took place 100 years ago, you know, in 13, more than 100. It's going to be a way to find that out, just like what Peter just mentioned. I have people on my job right now that's ready to give up money behind. They have the greatest respect for Peter as a writer. And it's going to be a process, you know, in memorializing Ben Fletcher. But at the same time, just like I have fights, I go all the way to the top because we're peers now, you know, that we need this history to be out there, because what we're confronting in the maritime industry is the automation. We came through. See, when Harry Bridges, all of them was in the ILA first before it split up West Coast. Everything is basically the same on the hiring system. You know, just like you have to come down there to find a job, it hasn't changed. You just have a union facility to go to that you have to get selected en masse now. But we're getting ready to move into the automation. And I was in China. 15 months, I saw what autonomous driving goes in. Just like what preceded that was the containerization. Now the containers are, everything is, you know, electrified. I mean, the technology is there. And we're going to lose jobs, okay? And we're going to gain some in jobs. But in the history of the ILA, I saw something done. It had to remind me, because I had the opportunity in my life in 72 and 73, you see what I'm saying, to see scientific socialism. I was in the Soviet Union. And so 30 years ago in 91, when that went down, I said, oh my goodness. And just like I thought we was gonna have socialism before I got to this age. But as that happened, now it's just a different, it's a different thing altogether. And see, what I've seen in China there, behind when you talk about that technological advance, it's going to affect all parts of our industry. You know what I mean? And we have to be prepared for it. And what I've been trying to get people to look at now is like the programs that was put forth in the 60s with containerization. And then we're going to have to work that out when you're talking about a job security program and stuff that Peter Thomas Paine thrown us out. That Thomas Paine name, and just like, you know, universal basic income and Andrew Yang and Andy Stern, he's the one that put it out there in a book to get it started after Change the Wind, not Change the Wind, it was Sweeney and SEIU that came in with the New Voices of America back in the 90s. Because the organized labor is so split up now. I mean, it's just going to be the ideas of where it come from the bottom now in order, just like what we're going to do with the extended contracts. And this is what young people have to learn right now, because it's for their future. You're going to have job security. And see, still, you know, you look into what Marx was writing about in Capital and all that, the surplus value is still going to be, they're going to be making more money, but what are we going to do with it in society? You know what I mean? Wow. Not let what they've been doing, the 1%, control it. This is going to have to be distributed, just like what Ben Fletcher was talking about, capital and labor. So this is where we're coming at, and it's not just, well, we want to set the example, even though just recently we left the AFL-CIO, But that doesn't stop us from having that alliance and that unity with all transport workers, you know. And I just find it even today here, trying to, what's taking place. I think healthcare will be one of our greatest industries. You see, right here now, we can't even roll out. We don't even have workers to roll out. They're trying to find, you got to go to the, you don't have workers to get the shot. But just even to back up to where our industry is at, organized labor they came to our convention 2 years ago and said, oh, y'all got it going on, guaranteed annual income, job security program, full pension, because as I had talked to my international, we 6-figure jobs, and even when I would say 125,000, that's not enough. You see what I'm saying? And I had to take in concern because I believe in the anti-poverty movement, and particularly with workers, low wage, the minimum wage, 15 is, you can't even get there. But I'm just saying, it's going to be coming from the roots of what Ben was talking about. We're going to have to get to that capital.
That's true.
We're going to have to get to it.
You mentioned about how your union recently split with the AFL-CIO, and even back in Ben Fletcher's day, the AFL was not really that helpful for workers in Ben's position. Could you talk a little bit? I know we have a couple minutes. Could you talk a little bit about why your union decided to split with the AFL-CIO?
Well, there's no information out to say, but I know it had to deal with jurisdiction in relationship to shipmaster and mates. And this is like where you find, see, the ILA in all ports is craft still. You see what I'm saying? You have different locals, checkers, carpenters, you know what I mean? Divisions like that in your jurisdiction on the job, as far as for like working on the ship. And as you take cargo through the terminals, you know what I mean? You be in different locals. And so, but the Master Mason pilots are not in that. Matter of fact, we don't see them till it comes time to negotiate a contract. But from the readings that I'm getting, they got chartered with the AFL-CIO without any type of a democratic process to take place with the ILA. And that's why they just shut them down. They said, we'll leave. And I was just at a convention 2 years ago and had to try to mend things together with people because the same thing happened with the International Longshore Warehouse Workers Union when they came back into the AFL-CIO. And what took place out there, I'm trying to think which one was that, 2002? No, that was during Occupy, 2013. That's when they had to split because of the outcome of, it was a part of the building church. What was a jurisdiction invasion then with them? And we were critical because we were able to we were moving to bring transportation together. I had a one-on-one with Sweeney. I can't keep going, but to bring the ILWU, the ILA back together, and also because it was that time with Jimmy Hoffa Jr. coming in, that the Teamsters were having a problem to bring us all together, but they did come around. We did have that unity. We did set up in 2000, okay? But we couldn't get back to that. And here we are moving towards it again because we could just say at the AFL-CIO, we out again, but we're together with the West Coast because we got some timing coming up, and I hope we can get our contracts together because they will have a problem. I think we're the most strategic, transportation the most strategic.
Yeah, and you've got experience raising hell, so really they should watch that.
Say that again?
Oh, I said you've got experience raising hell.
Well, that comes natural because of the nature of the work, but even though we're moving towards that automation, you have to see just how these ships are being worked now without humans, you know, and our jobs will be limited, but you have to protect them. I mean, our industry just in 100 years, this is a young country, but this is global. You know, that's what shipping in and it's strategic. So Today, young people on the waterfront are not understanding this here because we got a lot of work to do when you talk about a contract. You know what I mean? But we got time to get to that. But it's now time to learn and be educated, you know? So I'm looking forward to more information.
Nice. And there's one more question I wanted to ask you before. We have a lot of people that have questions, and I don't want to take up any of their time, but I guess my last question, just in regards to the lessons we learned from Ben Fletcher and early IWW organizing and just what you've seen throughout your career, what can today's organizers who are actively trying to fight racism and xenophobia and white supremacy in the labor movement, what lessons can they take from that? What do you think the biggest priorities should be?
In the fight against racism and the labor movement?
Yeah, because it's still a problem, as we all know.
I have to go back because going back into organized labor and all the organizations I've been involved in and still involved in, AFL-CIO, I mean, what we have done in the ILA through the Coalition of Black Trade Unions, which and conclusions, I think, remarks are made, or I'm getting that a little confused because it's Bill Foley that does it. But we're talking about these organizations, they Philip Randolph Institute, this struggle against racism, very difficult. I don't know how we're going to get to this. I mean, because see, in this period of time, with Trump still alive, it's impeachment today, but it still doesn't mean, I'm just thinking about the 700 million people, 74 million people that he has. To give an example, on our job, see, we're not, in our leadership, did not permit anything to go on our Facebook, get back to Trump, that supported Trump in the elections. But that was called from the top. They wouldn't take anything, no support. We had no support for him. But on the ground, without rank and file, here on the waterfront, just like with Brian, Brian Jones, if you had a Joe Biden Harris sticker on your car, we have longshoremen, that white working class longshoremen that were spiking, just plugging your tires with ice picks, whatever, to let the air out of your tires. Stuff like that there. And it hurts your co-worker, you know what I mean, that makes those decisions. So we still coming out of that framework, but it's scary about the 74 million. We already done seen this here. And it's a good portion of that, 40, 50, maybe percent of white workers. And now this is what we have to deal with, because see, what we do on our job, we would say to a co, like we working together, didn't you vote for Trump? No, I didn't. No, I didn't. That's there. But when they're not in bars or none of that, but when they get home, they just say, long live Trump, and they're going to continue to vote for him. So just starting on that basis, we got to get through this right now. I don't know how it's going to heal. This country is split way down the middle. And I just can't put a formulation together about how you're going to fight that racism when we put it on the offensive. We stepped it up, to get where they want to become fascists. And we still got a few days left. There might be some shootouts, So it's just so hard to go to labor right now and even to talk about it, because you're labor in the forefront of being involved in all the racism. It's just hard to answer that. I wouldn't even go to the point of production unless I'm questioning my coworker, up front, blatantly, are you ready to fight this here? And so just like I had someone, but I don't know who's on the line, because I got from a local that had from local 1242, Joe, last night. Oh, Royce, I had to get your number from somebody because I know you're going to be on the program tomorrow night. Okay. And I said, yeah, well, thank you very much. If Joe is out there, he can respond. But see, in that local, it used to be, it used to be lily white on the waterfront. But there are Blacks involved in that local now. And that's what people have to start at. You know what I mean? Because it looks bad. It looks bad when it comes to the workplace.
It's going to be a long week. It's going to be a long year. It's going to be a long fight. But
you don't know. The cops might start shooting each other in the next few days.
We'll see.
Well, I just want to thank Royce and Kim for this discussion, and thank you, Peter, for that great presentation, and also everyone out there. We still have almost 100 people here, so thank you all for the there's many questions that people have submitted, and before I get to the questions, I just want to mention, if you want to pick up a copy of the book, if you're based in Philly, we have plenty of copies of The Wooden Shoe. So that's 704 South Street. So yeah, if you're local, come on down and get it. Or if you want to message us, we also are doing like bike delivery and stuff like that if you don't feel comfortable coming out to the store. So just let us know. I'm also going to put the link to for people who don't live in Philly, if you want to order the book directly through PM Press. I'll include that link in the chat so you can order a copy for your comrades and for yourself to check out. So yeah, like I said, we have a bunch of questions that people have submitted that I've been collecting, and maybe just the first one. There's one directly for Royce, so maybe I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to kind of jump around, and we're going to go till 8:30. So hopefully we can get as many of these questions into the discussion as possible. But there was one directly for Royce, so I figured we can kind of maybe like finish that discussion a little bit, somewhat related. Jonathan Sudbury asked, do you think that the IWW story and legacy can be remodeled to speak to workers in your area today? Candidly, in other words, how powerful
I missed that.
can the legacy be?
Can it say it again?
Sure. He's wondering, do you think the IWW's story and legacy can be remodeled to speak to workers in your area today? And he says, in other words, how powerful can the legacy be, or do its principles carry forward without the flag itself, so to speak?
Well, I still have to start with where we're at now. You see, I feel as though under lock and key, you know, I'm a stay quarantine type behind my age, you know. Meetings, I mean, this is the way meetings go. So immediately, and not to say immediately, I say this, I mean, we're not prepared for this, not even the rollout. We weren't prepared for the testing, and it's on a higher level than that. But our healthcare system is bankrupt, as far as I'm concerned. So we're going to have to get through this, and it could go another 2 or 3 or 4 more years, and it's going to drain people mentally and physically, and we're going to die, many. So getting to where we can actually communicate to develop a trade union movement on the level, not on the level, but similar in a sense to say, well, what the Wobblies was doing, or either if there's a wake up, you know, in organized labor, you know what I mean? I just can't, you know, at this particular time, say that this can possibly happen. We're in a very dangerous situation. And we have to start all over again. It's not going to be just, you know, people thinking it's going to be a reset. You know, it's just a lot that we have to do and confront. But you're still going to have workers. I don't know how you're going to negotiate contracts. And you see, that's what we're going to have to start with, you know, to be able to show new ways to win on issues the issues are going to, I mean, just like we're going to have to start, I think the priority workers should be healthcare now. We need tens of thousands of healthcare workers, you know? How are you going to do 330 million people? And talking about we're going to do it with 15,000. And see, I was, you know, when I was in, I was right there before the Chinese discovered that there was a problem with the virus. That was Chinese New Year's. But I can say today, they contained it, you know what I mean? And with their healthcare, the system that they have there and all, look, 4,634 people died, you know, and they did that in 76 days and stopped that. But this is what we got dying every day, you know? And it's just hard to see any kind of future anytime soon. I'm just marking off on my job, our contract for settlement in 2024. You know, I don't think, you know, you just can't hear everything. We're on lockdown. We're trapped right now. You know, we can't get past Trump. We don't even know if it's going to be a shootout in the next few days for every day. You know, there's a threat. The threat of fascism is in this here country. We're talking about the white working class, you know? So I can't get past that about talking about if we can recreate this. You know, I can't get past that. We got to do just like I'm trying to get out of here. I'll be in Cuba next month. Whew, what a relief. I came out of Cuba this last time I've been out in March. Okay, the early part of March, National Labor, National Lawyers Guild Conference we do down there annually. And when I walked in at 1st of March, they had masks on, but we wasn't even thinking about masks. My doctor talking about getting a test. You see what I'm saying? To see to have the virus. We so far behind. So it's going to be very difficult, very difficult. But I can see, you know what I mean, what Fletcher was looking at, you know, in the future. And regardless of what we have to do to get there, because I'm great, I feel good. I went to the future. You see what I'm saying? I saw scientific socialism. You know what I mean? And then I thought I was on another planet when I was in China 15 months ago. I couldn't believe it. You see what I'm saying? And so where we're going to be at, and I'm sad to say because I'm an older person, but with the young generation, we got to get through this here. We got to get through this. And then I think it's good chances, you know what I mean, to fight against racism. We'll find out. We'll find out 2022.
Yes.
We can't leave away from that.
Thank you. I saw in the chat, we have Ben Fletcher's great nephew here, Khalid Rahim.
What?
So I did want to get to one of Khalid's questions. What about independent Black unions and political formations? And also, wasn't one of the most disappointing aspects of Ben Fletcher's work the apathy and racism of white workers? So either Peter or Royce, if you want to speak to that, that's from Ben Fletcher's great nephew.
Great nephew. You want it?
Yeah, I'll take that. So it's a pleasure to have you. I've actually tried to find family. Of course, Ben Fletcher had no children. And my attempts to sort of connect with family. So I'd love Khalid to sort of do so. If you could leave your email, or you can find me online. You know, I hope this doesn't sound too bad, but like, honestly, in a country where African Americans make up 12% of the population, it doesn't make sense to me to think of Black-only unions, because I think what Royce was saying actually were examples of how Black workers can organize within a society that is predominantly non-Black, right? He mentioned something called the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, which was founded in the early 1970s. And so that's a caucus of African-American men and women who are in different unions, who are mindful that there's a need to fight against and within the labor movement against racism, right? But thinking about that within, Ben Fletcher would actually reject the idea that Black should be in separate unions. It's actually, if you look at the book, there's countless documents where Fletcher argues against sort of self-segregation, right? And in the early 20th century, there was a powerful Black organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was a legendary Jamaican who lived in the United States for some years before he was imprisoned also. Fletcher is arguably the second most important Black political prisoner of the World War I era, Garvey being number one, right? And so there was lots of Garveyites in Philadelphia, right? And basically Black socialists rejected Garveyism, right? Because they said that's a false path, right? That there are other workers in the world other than people of African descent. And therefore, a sort of a socialist world is actually a world in which all people of all different groups are sort of part. Now, you could argue that Fletcher was somewhat, I won't say naive, but somewhat, he was of the sort that believed that socialism would abolish racism. I personally disagree with that, right? Fletcher rejected the idea that you would have sort of all Black institutions. He didn't think that that was logical, but it also was not his view of socialism, yeah? Nor was it of the IWW, right? And so this is actually an important question and one for rich discussion, right? But I can tell you that Fletcher would have rejected this notion that Blacks would sort of withdraw, right, from institutions that are predominantly non-Black, right? Because most people in the United States are not Black, right? And so, like I said, we could have a fascinating, lengthy conversation with 100 people on this, but Fletcher would have not supported the notion of Black unions. He was very much believed in interracial, multi-ethnic organizations, right? I see that Royce has some opinions there, wants to share. So can you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me? I think Ben Fletcher, just, you know, he was in that period. You got to realize he had to have knowledge of leading theoreticians or leading people that had already written about socialism, particularly the Communist Manifesto, Engels, Marx. You see what I'm saying? Where did these socialist ideas come from? You see what I'm saying? And so Marx's statement was, and this is what I think was at the bottom and the basis of Ben Fletcher's life. He said, as long as labor in the Black skin is branded, labor in the white skin can never be free. You know? And see, we had came through chattel slavery in the United States, and these scientists, they wrote about this here, but you know, it was just like Ben was in an industry that, what I like about shipping is that you learn, you get that news through different people on those ships that you talk to. And I think Ben would have saw it, that's where the basis he was coming through. And just like with Robin Kelly had stated in the introduction, you know, how his learning came about. But, you know, I'm trying to get back, I'm moving fast, but he would have did, I done lost my point, but you know, trying to think, but Fletcher would have been about that type of unity. That's why you call it racialism. And his idea of socialism, okay, he was practical. I mean, that's what it would have came to, you know, because understanding what was taking place. That's what when 10 days when he talked about John Reed and Ben knowing him, 10 days that shook the world. The first time socialism came into being and on this planet, you know, the 10 days when he wrote about that. This is what I was getting from that introduction that that Kelly wrote about. And your conclusion, bringing in those people that from Ben should be a part of with the struggles that Black people have been coming through with the boys, would always say. You're talking about Black radicals, you know, that's the legacy. And Ben was there. he would have seen socialism different. Just like, when I was in China, I said, guys, Chinese tell you in a minute, this is socialism with Chinese characteristics. I said, about the only way you'll ever get socialism again in the United States. And after, I don't want to go through those stages, but I know I would say I'd rather have socialism with Martin Luther King characteristics. But, I don't think we could see, because I'm blinded behind all this is happening right now, any form for Black people to go it alone, just like when you mentioned Garvey, I was brought up and back, it was between Garvey and Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam, and they had it, so I had to become, I was a Black nationalist until I moved on,
I wanted to bring in another question that perhaps Kim and Peter and Royce can all speak to. I think the question of automation was brought up earlier, and someone had a question related to that, which is kind of similarly this sort of like lessons for today, but like based on this history. And they added 90% of workers have no union, and most established unions are making little effort to educate them. And kind of connected to that, another person asked the question specifically with tech workers, and how can tech workers stand in real solidarity with workers affected by automation? So kind of like bringing those two questions together, do you want to speak to that, Kim, to start off, kind of based on some of the reporting that you've been doing recently, both kind of like these lessons for today, with like 90% of the workforce not being unionized, and also kind of various ways that other workers, and especially in the tech sector, can stand in real solidarity with people affected by this.
Right. So unfortunately, I cannot solve the big things on my own, but there is, even on the past week, I'll give an example of something that I think is very encouraging and hopefully signaling a broader trend in kind of a broadening class consciousness and sort of, feeling among workers of various industries that like, oh, we need to look out for each other because the bosses aren't, the government isn't, all we have is ourselves. The fact that the Alphabet Workers Union just went public last week. And I was actually on a stream with one of the organizers yesterday, and he said that they had like tripled their membership in 24 hours. And that is a union that it's solidarity unionism. It's a group of workers who are like, okay, we're a union, we're gonna organize to help our coworkers. We're not gonna have a contract. We're not gonna go through this traditional route. We're just gonna come together and advocate for ourselves. And I think that's something that is really important, really applicable to the tech worker space, because it is so, like, how the fuck do you unionize Google? Like, some people have tried, people are trying, but it's like unionizing a small city. Like, you need to use creative solutions here. And I think the IWW honestly is, organizers now outside of the IWW world should be looking to the IWW for lessons and for inspiration here, because like wall-to-wall organizing, industrial organizing, like one big union, it all makes sense, and it does actually work in this modern setting. The job titles and the job functions might be a little different, but the problems are the same, and the same kind of organizing can work. And in terms of automation, that is above my pay grade. I'm kind of following along with everybody else, but I do think, and I do hope that at the very least, like Royce was talking about, the crisis that we're in, that workers of every stripe, every industry, who have jobs and who don't have jobs, are kind of realizing how essential they are, and how essential, like the essential worker trope, that's, that was nice for a minute, and then the boss is like, okay, we're done with this, right? Like, I think people have realized that they do have power and that they're the only thing keeping us from absolute disaster. And I'm really hoping that we see more of this kind of, solidarity, it's a little Pollyanna-ish, it's a little slogan-y, but solidarity is the only thing that's going to get us through this, whether you are, a white collar Google employee or a person or a contractor at Google who's working in the kitchen. We saw just this past week, because we're still talking about Trump, he finally, like a million years too late, lost his Twitter account. And that wasn't because the vultures that run Twitter like suddenly found their conscience. It was because the workers at Twitter, like hundreds of them, signed a petition and pressured their boss to do something decent for once in their lives. Like we have so much power. We've been ground down so much, but we still have so much power. And I'm just hoping that this, I'm a little Pollyannish, but I do hope that we see some changes for good in the next few years, in the next few days, next few months, because we need something. Something's got to give.
So if I could chime in, I appreciate Kim's comments. Mainstream unionism has failed, right? Like the question said that 90% of workers aren't in unions. Although employers and the government are primarily to blame, it's also because our so-called leaders in the labor movement have failed. They've been failing for 50 years, right? That's one of the major reasons. Local 8 and the IWW never signed contracts. Everything I told you about how they got raises, how they integrated their workplace, they never signed a contract because they never wanted to give up their greatest power, our greatest power, the power to not work, right? Which is to say strike, right? Now, even without a majority of workers in a workplace, minority unionism, or what Kim called solidarity unionism, in fact, is a powerful force, right? There are countless examples where in places large and small, workers who basically are able to coordinate their actions are able to sort of gain some victories, often small, but you need the small victories before you can get the big victories, right? Like when you get small victories, more people join you, right? Like, I mean, everyone wants a revolution, but no one's going to jump on it because they're afraid, right? Like, and so what we need actually is, like Kim was saying, the IWW model is very, very potent, right? It has real potential in the 21st century, and not just for tech workers, because we all sort of like worship tech, but even in restaurants, right? Even in sort of very 19th century sorts of occupations, minority unionism, in fact, can work. It requires commitment, though, on the workers' parts, right? Instead of electing leaders and letting them tell us what to do, IWW model unionism demands rank and file activism and militancy, right? We need a lot more people like Royce in workplaces, but that happens when other workers recruit them. Yeah, like, and so although I'm happy to be in a union, the American Federation of Teachers, because I happen to be in a university that had one, right? Like, I didn't organize it, right? Like, but for those of us, the 90% who aren't, you don't have to wait, right? Actually, you can gain some power without waiting for even formal unionism. Although I actually think that in our system, it's better to have one than not, right? Like, and so I'm mindful that these huge issues, even the example of Royce was saying about, these jurisdictional splits. Unions are fighting over the 10% that are in unions, ignoring that the 90% aren't, right? Like that's, so when the ILA walks out because the masters, mates, and pilots are able to organize some sorts of workers, they're fighting, this craft model has failed, right? Like the industrial model, which the IWW endorsed and wasn't the first union to endorse by any means, right? The Knights of Labor, right? But the IWW model is the model of the mine workers, the steel workers, right? The Teamsters, right? Like what we need is industrial sector unionism, right? It's very clear, right? Like, especially because corporations are industrial wide, right? Like, so I am mindful of our time. Maybe Matt, you want to sort of take us home?
Yeah, sure. I guess there was one question about sort of like documenting IWW history. Maybe if we have like in the final minute, we can kind of just maybe end with that. Just thinking about like with this book, this history, and then also like the writing, the journalist work that Kim is doing and documenting this history for IWW chapters and union organizers, and kind of just any last thoughts on the importance for worker struggles today to be documenting this history.
Well, Utah Phillips was a famous Wobblian singer. And he said many times, right, that the history we learn in school is the history of the elite. We learn the history of the ruling class, right? Like we don't learn the history of ourselves in school, right? And so we have to unlearn the history of the elite, right? And learn the history of the rest of us, right? And so the IWW, I mean, my small attempts, the reason there's a second edition of my book is because a lot of people actually helped me find more documents after the first edition of my book was published, and it left out a lot of things because I didn't know about it, right? Like, and so these are collective efforts because that's the way ordinary people have always had the power, right? We don't have the power individually. We have the power only collectively. That's why the IWW image, right, of the people raising their fists together into a one big fist is such a brilliant image from 1917 that's as relevant in 2021, right? Like we have power, but only when we are we. When we are I, we don't have power, right? Like rich people have power individually, right? But if you reject that model, then it's us, right? Like, and so for me, the vision of the IWW is so inspirational. It's amazing that these firebrands created this thing in 1905, and I respect those who are still in it in 2021, right? Like, I do see the future of the IWW as being relevant after a long period in the second half of the 20th century when it was less so. Right? But I think it's needed now more than ever. And there's more Wobblies now than there were several generations ago, right? And they're in dozens of countries today too, right? Like, and so that gives me some hope, even though Royce was dishing out some lack of hope earlier in our session today. I want to thank everyone else for sort of being on this. Maybe other people want to sort of add a voice or two at the end.
Oh, and just in terms of preserving history, yeah, there's on a more I was looking at the question the person asked, and on like the most granular level, they're saying, well, you know, people used to organize and send letters, and those are physical objects. And now we use Signal and Keybase and Discord. Like, it's all very digital. And there's also that looming threat that Wobblies and radicals have also faced, like information security of like, who's watching you? Is the NSA agent in my laptop recording this? You know, like we have those concerns too, especially now that we are probably heading into yet another crackdown on organizing and radicals in this country. So, I mean, make a scrapbook. If you print things out and hide them under your bed, you know, you can go old school, even if we're still stuck in the modern times, right? Like, it's not as romantic to print out a Discord log, and maybe you're not saying anything that interesting there either, but your chapter emails and your correspondence with your closest comrades, you can save that and you can put it away somewhere safe. And then in 20 years or 50 years, you can give it to your, you know, grandchild or a younger person, be like, here, look, this is where you came from. You know, that's what I'm going to do. Hide it real far under my bed, but still. And just in terms of preserving our history, it's, you know, I'm so grateful for authors like Peter and for our living repositories of information, our elders like Royce. And I'm grateful that I'm able to have a platform to tell these stories where I write. Like, it's all the people's history. It's all important. And it's, you know, we can't lose it, and we can't let them take it away from us. Like you're saying, most of what we get taught in school is either lies, bullshit, or just the boss's narrative. We don't know our own history because they don't want us to know how powerful we are. They don't want us to know what we've won, how hard we've fought, how much blood has been shed. But I think learning and owning our own history is one of the most radical things we can do. Because like, once you know that, like, knowledge is the one thing they can't take away from us. So that's how I feel about that. And thank you all for being here and for talking to us and just for caring, because this is important.
Thanks a lot. Do you have any final comments, Royce, before we close out? Can you turn your mic back on and say that again?
Do you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. I was just stating that would like to see Peter to keep on writing about Ben Fletcher. There's a lot of history that's still there, you know, and another edition is due. And the introduction by Kelly, Robin Kelly would do a good job, because he had lined up many people that has resources that I know you can do things with about that history, because I'm still searching for it too. Great job, good job.
Thanks so much, Royce and Kim and Peter. And thank you all for joining us. And again, if you want to get a copy of the book, go to pmpress.org. And if you're in Philadelphia, come by the Wooden Shoe. And have a great night, everybody.
Thanks you, everyone. Be well.